There are two ways to enter Blender's sculpt mode, and that is in the upper left corner of the 3D view, switching from object mode to sculpt mode. Now, before we do that, understand that it is context specific. And so we need to have a mesh object selected or specifically active, as we can see here in the outliner, in order to access sculpt mode. If we have a camera, we will not see sculpt mode, neither for the light. So sculpt mode is specific to mesh objects and grease pencil as well, but that's not what this course is focused on. So with our mesh cube selected, we can switch to sculpt mode. That's method number one. And alternatively, we can switch to the sculpting workspace. So if we go back to object mode, again with our cube selected, switching to the sculpting workspace, tries to make the entire user interface ideal for sculpting. And namely, we can see that the timeline at the bottom has been removed because sculpting and animation are basically never done at the same time. Now, one quick thing to clarify, if we go back to the layout workspace, I mentioned that with a camera selected, you cannot enter sculpt mode, but you can enter the sculpting workspace. And so if you ever find yourself here, but you don't have access to sculpting tools, it means your active object is not a sculptable object. That has tripped me up more times than I like to admit. So we'll go back to our cube. And before we go into sculpt mode, digital sculpting expects a lot of vertices. And even though we can sculpt on just the 8 verts of this cube, if I switch to the grab brush, for example, we can absolutely move these verts around. And in certain situations, that is amazing. But by and large, sculpt mode's power lies with its ability to manipulate a lot of geometry very quickly, fluidly, and artistically. And so it's ideal to enter sculpt mode with a lot more verts than we have currently. So let's undo that, jump to object mode. And to quickly create a quote unquote digital ball of clay, I'm going to hold Control and hit the 5 key on the number row. This will add a modifier called subdivision because it subdivides our mesh and smooths it down. And this creates a lot more geometry for us to manipulate in sculpt mode. I'm actually going to increase the levels from 5 to 6. And then it's important that we apply this, which we can do with the down arrow apply, or we can hover our mouse inside the modifier and hit Control A. And so now that geometry, if we hit the tab key, is baked into the mesh. And this is the ideal kind of mesh to jump into sculpt mode and start playing with. And now's the right time to talk about the main areas we want to be aware of in the user interface. The first is on the left, which is our brush panel. And by default, it's only organized by the visual icon. You can see the name if you hover over it, but if you're getting started with sculpting, I recommend you click and drag the right edge. If you go a little bit, it creates 2 columns. And if you go a little bit more, you'll start to see all of the names listed. Personally, I've never been able to memorize all of the brush icons as much as I can quickly identify the name. And so at this point, I highly encourage you to just start clicking on brushes and experimenting on your ball. Explore the various behaviors and functions in a very free-form way. We're going to go over all of this in detail, but this is kind of a rite of passage for your first time digital sculpting, is simply playing around with a sphere. So the brush panel is something you will definitely be familiar with. The other important area is at the top. It's in the header, and these are important settings for your brush and for sculpt mode in general, like the radius of your brush, the strength of your brush, several menus with very important and plentiful options. In the upper right corner, we have our typical viewport overlays, but we have a new one that is specific to sculpt mode and has to do with your masks and your face sets. We're going to go over all of this, but I'm just trying to point to the general areas you want to be aware of first. And so that's your brush tools, your header, and that's really it. So often I like to maximize this viewport with Control Spacebar because the outliner and properties often aren't needed. However, there is an alternative. If I hit Control Space again, in the Properties panel, we do have Tool Properties. And this actually is a duplicate of all our brushes and settings from the left and top of the viewport. So it's quite redundant to have both of these open at the same time. Why they're duplicated options, I'm not exactly sure, but options are good. I know if you're coming from ZBrush, you might be more familiar with your settings on the right side. And so you can hit the T key to hide your brushes on the left, and then right click in the top and disable show header. And you can maximize real estate this way. It's up to you. Personally, I prefer the left and top versus the right. Note that to bring back the header, We just have to click that little arrow. And so the last thing I want to touch on is how we physically interact with our digital clay. You can probably hear me clicking around because I'm using a mouse. So it's very possible to sculpt with a mouse, but there's another option that's far more popular and recommended, honestly, and that is a pen and tablet. So if I switch that, this is a peripheral that makes the sculpting experience much more intuitive. Holding a pen and sculpting in many ways feels more natural, and it also comes with the added benefit of pressure sensitivity, which we can see here with these little icons beside the radius and strength, so that the harder you press, the stronger the effect becomes. And if I enable it for radius, the lighter I touch, the smaller the brush, and the more I push, the broader the brush. And so the pressure sensitivity does play a significant role in that intuitive artistic control. And there's a wide variety of tablets available. I have a Wacom, and that's generally the most popular, longest running tablet company, but there's also Huion, which I have owned before. So there's plenty of options both for low budgets and high budgets. I've always opted for a low budget option. So if you're new to sculpting and you're not sure if it's something you want to do long term, start with the mouse and see what you think. But if you find yourself really interested in sculpting, you're gonna want to invest into a pen and tablet. Now, depending on your operating system, you will have settings available to you. And for me, my Wacom settings are pretty much default, but I did change the pen buttons so that the middle click is on the bottommost index finger button, right click is on the button above that, and your regular left click is assigned to the tip. And so that is a taste of sculpt mode. Let's get into the specifics next.